August 1945. The skies over Tokyo were scorched by waves of bombs, and then came the news no one wanted to hear. Japan had unconditionally surrendered. For millions of Japanese people, it was a moment of collapse. For the elderly who had lived their entire lives in the glory of the empire, it was a true nightmare. Many of them were not soldiers. They were retired clerks, teachers, engineers, or even farmers swept up in the machinery of war. But in the eyes of the occupying forces, anyone who had served the empire could be a target for investigation. And so, groups of Japanese people, including white-haired elderly, were escorted by American soldiers to detention camps. No one knew what the future held. Rumors spread quickly. They'll execute us all to avenge Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the thousands of prisoners who died at Japanese hands. The elderly huddled in corners of the camps, listening to the wind whistling through barbed wire, whispering among themselves. One scoffed bitterly. Justice, the Americans say. The justice of the victors has only one path: death. Those words made many weathered faces crumple, a mix of fear and bitterness. The camps weren't what they had imagined. They weren't places of immediate execution, but temporary holding facilities with wooden barracks, bunk beds, and communal mess halls. The Americans gave them unfamiliar rations: bread, powdered milk, watery coffee. The elderly exchanged glances, wrinkling their noses. They call this food. It's not even as good as a bowl of cold rice from home. They mocked the American rations, seeing them as an insult. But when hunger gnawed, they chewed the hard bread and sipped the bitter coffee. At night, many couldn't sleep. They missed their homeland, the temples, the rice fields. But their greatest fear was, when would the Americans take them to the gallows? Among the detainees were those who had once held minor roles in the government. One had stood before hundreds of employees, issuing orders with authority. Now he lined up for rations, called by a number instead of his name. Another, a retired teacher, had spent his life instilling loyalty to the emperor in his students. Now, trembling, he wrote statements for the Americans, explaining why he had served the regime. They felt humiliated, powerless. Trembling hands, white hair, clouded eyes, all awaiting a verdict yet to be announced. In the corners of the camp, each night the elderly gathered, sharing what they'd overheard from the guards. Some said the Americans were preparing trials to judge them all. Others claimed that even the smallest connection to the regime would mean a death sentence. One old man sneered. "Don't you remember what we did to their prisoners? They'll return it in kind." Don't expect mercy dry laughter echoed, but no one found it truly funny. Day after day, they watched the American soldiers. They saw young guards, sometimes polite, offering cigarettes to those coughing harshly. This confused them. Why would the enemy show such humanity? One whispered, "Maybe it's just a pretense. One day they'll call our names, and we'll never return." That fear clung to every meal, every fitful sleep. In 1945, in the early days after defeat, the detained Japanese elderly lived in a whirlwind of rumors, fear, and humiliation. They mocked the American rations, scoffed at the justice of the victors, but deep in their hearts, they trembled at the prospect of a death sentence trial. Little did they know, what awaited them would be entirely different, a path leading to astonishment, even disbelief. The first weeks in the camps were a chaos of rumors and fear. But as time passed, the elderly began to notice a routine taking shape. Each day began with a bell, followed by lining up for breakfast, roll call, and waiting for interrogations. The Americans didn't rush everyone to trial. Instead, they began questioning individuals. In a small room, with a guard standing behind and an American officer at a wooden desk, stacked with thick files, the questions came. What position did you hold? Did you ever manage prisoner camps? Did you ever order executions or mistreatment? The questions repeated, delivered in a cold but not hostile tone, no shouting or whips like they had once used on prisoners. One elderly man left the interrogation room, pale, whispering, "They know so much. Every detail. I don't know how rumors spread. The Americans had detailed records, witnesses, even photographs. This heightened the camp's anxiety. Many believed this was just a prelude to convictions and executions. In the long nights, they whispered. One laughed bitterly. They call this justice? It's a farce. The victors write the rules, and we'll die no matter what we say." Another nodded. Yes, back home, how many American prisoners survived? The justice of the strong is death for the defeated. They mocked American justice, convinced it was a charade. Yet deep down, fear gnawed at them. While awaiting judgment, hunger still demanded attention. The American rations became the greatest source of mockery. White bread, peanut butter, Spam, watery coffee. The elderly shook their heads. They call this food? No rice, no dried fish, no miso. It's humiliating. But they had to admit the truth. Though unpalatable, the rations kept them full. No one starved. Some began to secretly look forward to meals, even learning to eat bread slathered with salty peanut butter. One whispered, "It's not so bad." This surprised even them, though none dared admit it openly. What confused them most was how the American soldiers treated them. They expected beatings, humiliation, as they had done to prisoners. But the guards, mostly young men, just did their jobs. Some smiled, offered cigarettes, or slipped extra sugar packets to those coughing. One afternoon, a guard saw an elderly man shivering and quietly draped his own jacket over him. The old man froze, eyes wide. "Why, I was your enemy." The soldier shrugged. "You're a prisoner now." "I'm just doing what's right." The story spread through the camp, sowing a mix of suspicion and shock. Day by day, they realized the mass executions weren't happening. Instead, the Americans categorized, interrogated, documented. Some were called multiple times, likely due to past roles. Others faced simple questions and returned to their cells. The elderly began to wonder, maybe not everyone will be executed. Could there be a chance to survive? Nightly talks shifted from mockery to cautious discussions. They observed the Americans' management, curious about this justice process. Yet fear never fully faded. News arrived. In Tokyo, high-ranking officers faced trials and death sentences. One old man hissed, "See? We'll all go eventually. It's just not our turn yet." No one knew what the future held. But one thing became clear. American justice wasn't simply immediate revenge. It was something more complex, slower, and harder to predict. In those days of waiting, the Japanese elderly lived between two extremes, mocking American justice while marveling at the unexpected kindness they received. Strange rations, humane treatment from guards, serious but bloodless interrogations, all made them question. Were we wrong to think death was the only path? They remained afraid, hearing grim news from Tokyo, but somewhere deep inside, a faint spark of hope began to glow. The days in the detention camps, after news of the trials, felt like a black curtain descending, shrouding the minds of the Japanese elderly. They had always thought of themselves as ordinary civilians, having spent their lives tilling fields or running small shops in Japanese communities in California, Hawaii, or Washington. But now they were labeled potential threats to national security, suspected solely because of their nationality and bloodline. In the camps, news spread quickly despite the American Guard's efforts to control it. Whispers circulated that some Japanese faced military tribunals, others special courts. Fear grew, especially when a few elderly heard rumors of death sentences for spies or traitors, white-haired men with trembling hands, used to quiet lives of farming or working in small workshops, now found themselves equated with armed enemies. Women who had tended grocery stores now slept in crowded wooden barracks, listening to the wind howl through thin walls, hearts heavy with unease. Each morning, a whistle woke them. No one could leave the barbed wire fences. Every activity was monitored. Younger detainees had enough strength to work in small vegetable gardens or clean latrines, but the elderly could only sit huddled, watching sunlight filter through iron bars. One cried out, "At our age, must we die in a foreign land, branded as criminals?" The question hung in the air, bringing tears to many eyes. No one could answer, for the future seemed veiled. They heard of trials in Tokyo, where the Allies judged Japanese generals and officials, names far removed from their own lives. Yet, despite their lack of connection, they were caught in the same net, the shadow of suspicion cast by the war. Around small fires at night, the elderly whispered about the harsh sentences they'd heard of. Some said a group in Hawaii, accused of espionage, faced heavy punishment. Others claimed, "I heard they might shoot an entire group of frail old people here." No one knew the truth, but the mere thought of guards calling their names in the dark was enough to make them tremble. Some, weak-hearted, took to their beds, spirits broken. The waiting, not knowing when their turn would come, was the harshest sentence of all. It was like a blade hanging overhead, not striking but keeping them in constant fear. Though restricted, some elderly tried to send letters to Japan. They dared not detail their fears, only urging their children and grandchildren to stay healthy and pray for reunion. One wrote, "Your parents are old and frail, unsure if we'll see cherry blossoms again. It's cold here, but we hold the image of home in our hearts. If anything happens to us, don't harbor resentment. Live on in peace." Some letters were sent, others were held back by guards, but writing those words eased the weight of their fears. In this mental crisis, the elderly grew closer than ever. They shared scraps of food, thin blankets. One woman quietly gave her porridge to a sick man. A stooped old man helped those too weak to walk to the sunlight. In a place where they were labeled enemies, they found humanity and comfort in each other. These small acts helped many endure days that seemed unbearable. Night was the most terrifying time. Each sound of a guard's boots on the corridor made hearts pound. They feared their names would be called. One recounted how the mere click of an iron lock drenched him in cold sweat. One night, guards did call a group. The barracks fell silent, thinking the executions had begun. But they were only taken for questioning. Still the fear lingered, leaving them with the sense that death could come at any moment. Amid this terror, glimmers of hope crept in. Priests and American lawyers visited, saying committees would review the cases of frail, elderly prisoners. Some journalists began asking, "Is it just to detain people in their 70s and 80s just because they're Japanese?" Hearing this, a faint light sparked in the elderly's eyes. But doubt lingered. Were these just comforting words, with sentences still awaiting? Day after day they endured the same exhausting cycle. Morning roll call, meager rations at noon, afternoons under barbed wire, evenings holding their breath at the sound of boots. The waiting wasn't days, but months, even years. For those at life's end, each anxious day was torment. The air remained tense, suffused with fear. The Japanese elderly lived each day as if standing at death's door, unsure when fate would call their names. Yet in the darkness of despair, a faint hope flickered, that justice or mercy might save them from a tragic end. After months of despair, with death seeming to creep ever closer, an unexpected shift emerged for the Japanese elderly detained in the US. News of their plight began to leak out, drawing attention from the press, human rights groups, and some American politicians. At first, voices of dissent were sparse. Some Americans, especially those familiar with Japanese families, couldn't fathom why elderly men and women in their 70s and 80s were deemed security threats. They wrote to senators, submitted articles to newspapers, emphasizing that these people had lived in American communities for decades, contributing through labor, and now, old and frail, could hardly be spies or saboteurs. A local paper ran a headline, "Enemies or Our Grandparents?" The article described frail elderly leaning on canes in the camp yard, likening them to readers' own parents or grandparents. It posed a haunting question. If these were your parents, would you want them treated this way just for their bloodline? Public attention spurred action from volunteer lawyers. They sought access to the camps to gather information. Initially, guards were suspicious and denied entry, but after persistent efforts and intervention from sympathetic politicians, they were allowed in. These meetings opened a new chapter for the elderly. For the first time in months, they could share their stories, decades of hard work in America, their longing for home, their belief in their innocence. One trembling old man told a young lawyer, "I've lived here nearly 40 years. I grew vegetables, sold them at the market. I know nothing of war or the military, yet they want to kill me because I'm Japanese." The lawyer sat silently, then whispered, "We won't let that happen." Reports were sent out. Stories of injustice spread quickly. Religious organizations, especially Catholic and Protestant churches, began urging the U.S. government to treat Japanese prisoners, particularly the elderly and sick, more humanely. Some congressmen questioned the Justice Department and military. "We fight for freedom, but what does that mean if we imprison innocent elderly?" In the camps, these reports spread by word of mouth. At first, the elderly were skeptical, fearing it was just another comforting rumor bound to disappoint. But as lawyers and priests visited, hope began to grow. One woman whispered to her bunkmate, "Maybe we haven't been abandoned. Maybe. God still hears our prayers." Her eyes lit up, and for the first time in months she smiled. Then one day, guards called a group of elderly to leave the camp. Unlike previous interrogations, they were taken to a small hearing room with lawyers, officials, and press representatives. The atmosphere was heavy, but no longer deathly silent. Volunteer lawyers stood, presenting each case. An old man who donated land for a school in California's Japanese community. A woman who spent her life raising a family, never straying far from her small grocery store. Another man who contributed to the American Red Cross during tough times. The lawyer concluded with an emotional plea. Do these people deserve to be treated as enemies, led to execution like dangerous criminals? Many Americans in the room were moved, some to tears. After hours of debate, the panel announced that no final decision could be made yet, but any executions of these elderly would be indefinitely postponed pending clearer investigations. For the elderly, this was akin to a reprieve. Many burst into tears, embracing each other. They couldn't believe that after months of fearing death, they now had hope of survival. One trembling old man whispered, "I thought I'd die here, but perhaps God has opened a path for us." The news spread beyond the camp. Reports of the hearings swept across America. For the first time, many Americans saw images of frail, white-haired elderly behind barbed wire. They realized that behind the abstract Japanese label were human beings, not unlike their own parents or grandparents. This empathy grew, pressuring the government to change its approach. That night in the camp, sighs gave way to soft singing for the first time in months. Some elderly gathered, singing Japanese folk songs. Their voices trembled, faltering, but filled with hope. One said, "We're not free yet, but at least death isn't as close as before." Moonlight glinted on tears streaming down their faces, tears of relief, of belief that justice might still exist somewhere. The Japanese elderly, after months of awaiting execution, were unexpectedly shielded by public opinion, lawyers, and American communities. They weren't yet free, but the shadow of death had receded. And in each heart, a question echoed. Could this be the start of true liberation? The weeks following the hearings brought a noticeable shift in the camp's atmosphere. The fear of execution no longer loomed as heavily, but uncertainty lingered. No one knew what the US government's final decision would be. Some whispered, "They say it's postponed, but it could be a delay tactic. One day they'll call our names and take us in the night." Others were more hopeful, believing public attention would prevent cruelty. Hope and fear intertwined, making each day both endless and tense. One early autumn morning, as leaves outside the camp turned golden, the guards announced something extraordinary. The U.S. Justice Department would release elderly prisoners uninvolved in military or espionage activities. The camp fell silent. The elderly exchanged glances, hearts pounding. Would their names be on the list? An American officer stepped forward, reading names aloud. Each name sparked gasps from the crowd. Some elderly wept, others trembled, unable to stand, and some collapsed in disbelief. As lawyers and journalists had fought for, most frail, sick, or lifelong farmers and shopkeepers were to be freed. That day, military trucks carried the elderly away from the camp. They were taken to reception centers where charities and Japanese-American communities awaited. As the barbed wire gates closed behind them, one woman knelt, kissing the ground, sobbing, "I never thought I'd see a free sky again." A man beside her, eyes red, whispered, "I prepared to die as a criminal. Today I live as a human." What stunned them wasn't just escaping execution, but the warm reception from some American communities. Churches organized fundraisers, providing temporary shelter, food, and clothing. One local church hung a sign, "Welcome home, neighbors." The elderly were shocked. For months they'd seen themselves as public enemy number one, destined for elimination. Now strangers opened their arms. One trembling old man held a bowl of hot soup, tears falling. Why are they kind to us after everything? The question had no immediate answer, but it struck them like a shock of kindness. Not all were released. Some with military ties or suspected of espionage remained detained for further investigation. This weighed on those freed, who embraced their friends left behind, promising to pray and advocate for them. One said through tears, "This freedom isn't complete while my friends remain behind bars." As time passed, the released elderly struggled to rebuild. They started from nothing, having lost property and, for many, families. But something new blossomed. They no longer saw Americans solely as enemies. Some even spoke at events, sharing their experiences as proof that hatred need not last forever. At a church ceremony, one said, "I thought death was certain, but the compassion of those who called me an enemy saved me. If that's real, reconciliation can be real too." The story of these Japanese elderly became part of the historical memory of wartime internment. It reminded future generations that even in the darkest times, justice and humanity could speak. Years later, as the elderly passed away, their descendants retold the tale, a testament that history isn't just battles and death sentences, but also moments of forgiveness and humanity. From their first days in captivity, they mocked American rations, despised the victor's justice, and were certain death awaited. But bit by bit, they witnessed unexpected kindness from guards, dedication from lawyers, the voice of communities, and the rise of compassion. When the barbed wire gates opened, they could hardly believe their eyes. Elderly who expected execution stepped into freedom's light, welcomed instead of forsaken. A saying lingered in many memories. We lost the war, but perhaps in humanity we gained a greater lesson.